welcome to this week's Our Performance Tips. My name is Jessica Morgan and I'm your host today. I'm excited to introduce you to Seth Gulley, our Performance Improvement Specialist, and he will be discussing the benefits and hazards of oxygen. Before we begin, I want to go over the On24 platform a little bit with you here. On the right, you will notice the media player. That is where you will see our pictures. Below that is the speaker's bio, and underneath that one is our question submission box. And on the left, there is the sphere in the corner there. That will take you to our website if you have any further questions. Below that is a link to register for next week's continuing education event. Next week, we will be joined with Jason Brewstead, where he will go over cognitive interviewing, how to get to the heart of an issue. And below that is a box with some additional resources, and you will also have the option, if you follow that link there, to submit questions for next month's continuing education event, which will be a panel discussion on leadership. And then at the bottom, there is a link there to register for that continuing education event. It should be a pretty interesting discussion. And at the very, very bottom, there is a menu bar there that allows you to forward this information to a friend, to send us an email if you have further questions that are not addressed throughout the presentation. So feel free to mess around with the console, make things bigger, smaller, move them around however you want them to. And so without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to Seth Gulley.
All right. Hey, guys. Welcome to Lucas OPT On24. And I'm going to talk to you about oxygen today. So we offer Oxygen Administrator course. It of course, is for first aiders, first responders, and medical providers, or just businesses that want to add another level of preparedness to their folks and in a real simple, cost-effective manner. And you'll understand what the benefits of some of this really is when we add or enhance people with oxygen during an emergency. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about, where this all came from, right? So we breathe oxygen, and, a scientist that kind of invented or found oxygen was pretty impressive, so they actually found this stuff probably, 2,500 years ago that oxygen is what we breathe. And 2,500 years ago they identified the fact that we have all kinds of things like water, and we have fire, we have air, and we have earth, right? And then came along some other people that decided, hey, there's a little bit more something to this stuff. So the guy is Joseph Priestley. So this guy in 1774, he discovers oxygen. So up until this time, we just know we breathe air. And so oxygen was discovered. He called it something else, but, inevitably we wound up calling it oxygen. And he did a lot of experiments on pets, that we would call pets today, but like guinea pigs and regular pigs and dogs and stuff like that, different things they did in those days, right? And he found out that, enhancing these animals with oxygen wasn't necessarily such a good thing. But we use this on a regular basis, right? So they did a few different studies. And he had a few people that were, somewhat skeptical as well. But he found out that oxygen and saturating an environment with oxygen actually had a negative effect. So these animals wound up dying as a result of too much oxygen. So I'm going to progress aside here. So yeah, you got your little guinea pig in this controlled environment, and we're just pumping it full of oxygen, right? So he's probably 100%, 90 to 100% saturated with oxygen. So these little guys, they were in this exposure for about 5 days. And over the 5 days became, they started seeing some diminishing health effects on these little creatures. And then a little bit later, they did a little bit longer, and probably here we're at a week. maybe just over a week, and they wound up dead. And as they found out, they became oxygen toxic. So they were saturated with so much oxygen that their body couldn't function as it was designed to do. So does that mean that too much oxygen is potentially bad for us? Well, it is, because everything, as we're going to talk here in a few more slides, it's a balance. Oxygen can be good in certain circumstances, but too much of it can be bad in others. So, of course, without, any other kind of skeptics of the day and the primitive research methods that people used back then, there were a few scientists that were like, okay, great, too much oxygen, really? There's no way that this is going to impact humans the same way. So there's these two scientists, and they decided that, you know what, we're going to try this experiment on ourselves. So they put themselves in a controlled environment for 90% oxygen for about, I believe it was 65 hours total is how long they were exposed. And within the first 12 hours, they were already starting to experience some negative effects. They had burning in their arms, they had burning on their face, burning on their legs, and just the severe kind of burning feeling that continued to get progressively worse the longer they were in this atmosphere. And in fact, they started to feel kind of nauseous even, and started with some other issues, even headaches. And the longer they progressed, the worse their condition got. And you're thinking, they're in 100% oxygen or 90% oxygen. Why is this having such a negative impact? So after the whole experiment and, the self-infliction of all this stuff, they actually wound up being hospitalized. One of them ended up in the hospital for like 6 weeks. And it took that long for their vitals to return to normal again, to where they now could start kind of functioning the way that they were supposed to. And it was all because they were saturated with oxygen. Again, this is one of those kind of happy balances, right? We have this exchange in our body that takes place. When we have too much, something else compensates. When we have too little, something else compensates. It's kind of like your spine in a way, right? If your spine's kind of out of whack, then the rest of it's compensating to try to get you back in order. And they're just a bunch of building blocks that impact each other, or like playing Jenga. One thing kind of starts to teeter until one thing sends it all over the edge, and then you got to start all over again. So it is a happy balance. Now, oxygen can be a good thing, but oxygen can also be a bad thing. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail on this. So what does oxygen do? Well, oxygen is fantastic for converting energy. So we use ATP, so adenosine triphosphate. That is the energy that we use. It's what makes our muscles work, our neurons firing. It is what oxygen is the receptor for to convert all these different elements and chemicals and the things we eat into ATP, into energy. So if we have too much of it, then those receptors kind of get saturated and we don't know what to do with it. The place that these are utilized the most in the body is the mitochondria. And this is where we actually generate this ATP. This is where we get that energy production and that exchange from oxygen into the energy that we use in our body. And so we use that. It's something we don't store. We have to constantly replenish it. So if we have a diminished amount of oxygen environment, that's why we almost immediately get lightheaded. So anybody out there, I'm sure, has stood up way too fast and you get lightheaded and you're like, whoa, I stood up too fast. Well, that's the case of your blood pressure dropping, which if your blood pressure drops rapidly, you also have oxygen being diminished to your brain. And that exchange happens so fast that you get lightheaded and you feel like you're potentially going to pass out. So it's amazing how quickly the gases are exchanged inside the body. And that's why oxygen is constantly needing to be replenished. Or if we get into an atmosphere that has too little, our body almost instantly reacts to it because those gases and exchanges are so fast. So we can saturate our systems so much so that it doesn't function. Another kind of example of saturation of oxygen is hyperventilation. So if anybody's ever hyperventilated or been around somebody who's hyperventilated, hyper means too much. So a lot of people think, well, they're not breathing, they can't breathe. Well, theoretically, yes. However, they're getting plenty of air, getting plenty of oxygen. They're just not breathing out. So they're hyperventilated. They're too much oxygenated, for lack of a better way of saying it. So, you give them a paper bag. Everybody's seen this probably in the movies, or you have had it in real life, and they breathe into this paper bag. Well, there's this thing of diminishing returns and exchanges of gas. So you have oxygen that's high and CO2 that's low, and eventually you build up more CO2 and you inhale that CO2, bringing your body back into a normal level. So you got to have, again, this balance. If you don't have balance, your body's not going to function correctly. And that's where oxygen can be good and bad. So let's go into this. Let's talk a little bit about the negative. Let's talk about saturation. Another example of saturation might be salt water. In fact, this past week, I did an experiment with my daughter for school, and she took the example that is in the picture there. That's salt water. However, we used sugar water, and so we took varying amounts of sugar, and we put like 1 teaspoon in and 2 teaspoons in, and then we did another one and put it in another beaker, and we put 4 teaspoons in, and then we did another one and put 6, and so on and so forth. So we had 8. And then we took food coloring and made all of them different colors. And then we slowly pipetted, or took up with a turkey baster is what we had, pulled it all up, and we put it in a whole separate beaker, and we started with the heaviest one first. So whatever color that was, I don't know, I can't remember if it's blue or green, but we started with the one that was the most saturated, and we put that on the bottom, and then we took the next one, and then we put it on top. And if you looked at it from the side, you saw these varying layers, and they stayed as different layers because they were at different levels of saturation of sugar. Well, there is a point in time where things become so saturated that is the term itself, saturated. You can't add any more. So like the picture that you guys see on the screen, there's so much salt in that water that the salt won't dissolve anymore. You can keep adding it, but it just starts piling up on the bottom of the salt water, and it doesn't work to absorb it. It's going to just fill up with salt on the bottom until it overflows. So this is technically what happens inside the body. We get oversaturated to where we can't exchange gases anymore. And though oxygen is good, we also need nitrogen. We also need carbon monoxide. We need carbon dioxide. We need all these different elements in a perfect balance to help us stay alive, help us exchange. In fact, the air we breathe is roughly 21% oxygen, and it's somewhere around 79% nitrogen. So you're like, hey, aren't we technically nitrogen breathers? Well, there's more nitrogen in the air than there is oxygen. However, our body doesn't exchange nitrogen to make energy. It uses oxygen. So there are some different circumstances, right? We have to have oxygen in order to live and make energy. So moving on, the benefits of oxygen, tremendous, right? Especially in an emergency situation. So if we have somebody that is, been injured or is having some kind of allergic reaction or is bleeding profusely or just in a bad state to where, their body has had this reaction that we call shock. And shock is where the body is inefficient at providing oxygen to the things that we need. So like a heart attack can cause shock. Anaphylaxis, so allergic reactions can cause shock. other chemicals can cause your body to go into shock. So if you go like, confined space, your body can be saturated with whatever chemical or gas is in that space, and your body goes into shock because it can't pass air back and forth, or oxygen. So your body goes into shock with countless versions and variations of incidents. I, 41, and I think that I'm 16 sometimes because I like to ride my bike, and it's not a mountain bike, it's not a beach bike, it's a BMX freestyle bike. Now, my kids thought it was cool until I, got 2 concussions, and I'm grounded currently. However, I went into shock, and I wasn't feeling so good, and I had to sit down. I had to kind of breathe, and you know what? Oxygen probably would have helped me in that circumstance. Doesn't mean I'm breathing 100% oxygen, but what it does is it allows a higher percentage of oxygen for me to take in and help with that exchange, because I'm diminished in my ability to exchange those gases, create that energy, and it would help me feel better again and my body to recover from that accident a lot quicker. So in emergency situations, oxygen can be extremely beneficial. Now, there are times that oxygen, again, can be negative, right? So we can get into circumstances where people get used to being being consistent with their percentage of oxygen. So if I'm into the 89 percentile of oxygen in my body, I probably am starting to get pretty bad. We need to be up into the 90s. If I have a pulse oximeter or something to measure on my finger how much saturation of oxygen I have in my body, it should be right around the 94 to, if it's fantastic, maybe even 98. But if I start getting into the high 80s, I'm struggling to breathe. I'm having a hard time a bit, although there are circumstances like a COPD patient where your body gets accustomed to operating at that level. And if we give high flow oxygen, it may have a negative impact on that person, because now we're giving them way more than they need and their body doesn't know what to do with it. So it actually causes their body to react in a shock-like fashion, and it doesn't work. So it is a perfect balance of things that are out there, right? So oxygen is good, but oxygen can be bad. Perfectly administered, yes, it's a win, but only in the right conditions and right quantities. So if you have conditions that require supplemental oxygen, definitely follow your doctor's prescription level and flow rates and recommendations. In an emergency situation, for those short-term, oxygen is fantastic and can really help improve the outcome of a patient. So, and if you're not using them, I highly encourage you. It's very easy to get. It is a loophole in the FDA regulations because oxygen, let's face it, is a drug. And in order to get it in a prescription, you have to have a need. Well, when you get it for an emergency use and strictly emergency use, you don't have to have a prescription to do that. But it's limited to emergency use only. So if you have a business or something that you may want to add this to your tool in your toolbox, this is a very easy way to add this to that. That's cost effective and adds a tremendous value to people in some kind of conflict or some kind of hazardous condition or trauma or injury of some kind. And it has some very good healing properties to it. And it's very safe to do. So on the safe side, oxygen does not explode. Oxygen, in fact, doesn't burn. What oxygen does is it encourages, it helps. You need oxygen to aid in the burning process. So things that are saturated with oxygen, man, they burn fast and they burn hot. But oxygen all by itself does not burn. So it's actually relatively safe. And if you guys ever take this class on learning how to administer oxygen, it's fantastic. We go through all of that. It's safe, it's sound, it's beneficial. So with that, I'll move on to our wrap-up slide here. So oxygen. It's a balanced approach. If you can provide it in the emergency situation with high flow in a condition that somebody is in shock, it's going to have life-saving properties, and it will definitely aid in their ability to recover. Other conditions where you use it on a continuing basis, definitely want to use it at the doctor's discretion and doctor's prescription, and not just use it on a whim. You want to stay within those guidelines of how it's operated. So too much of a good thing can be bad. So follow the directions. Supplemental, it's fantastic. You do need training in it if you do decide to give it. Again, we offer the administrator course. It's about an 1.5 to 2 hour class. And it's similar like first aid, CPR. It's a 2-year qualification that you can get, but a tremendous value to add to your staff, to your environment, to the public, if you guys so choose to do so. And then there are some loopholes in the regulations. OSHA, they require the training period. So if it is something you add to your first aiders or first responders, then it stays with that 2-year requal. So they regulate the training. And then, of course, it's a drug, so FDA regulates it. However, if it's used for emergencies, you don't have to have a prescription. And you can add it to your arsenal of tools and stay up on your training, and you're good to go. So with that, oxygen can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. So know how to use it, do your research, or in fact, take a class on how to administer it. And I thank you guys all for letting me speak to you today. And hopefully we may see you in a class somewhere soon. Thank you very much. Jess, back to you. I'll take some questions too.
Yeah, thank you so much. We had a couple of questions come in, and one of them was, you mentioned that kind of the body compensates, and you gave the example of when someone's hyperventilating into a bag. If, like in the instance when you had your concussion and said you were going into shock, is there something that people can do at home to help with that before EMS arrives? Or is that something that we just kind of have to wait on until emergency services arrive?
No, that's an excellent question. So I'll speak directly to shock, because not everybody has access to oxygen, right? Oxygen is a benefit and an enhancing element. But if you have something like that at home, you can definitely help increase your blood pressure, which will also help increase the transferring of oxygen and nutrients across barriers and back into your brain by simply elevating the legs. Getting somebody laying down on the ground, elevating your legs about 12 inches, 8 to 12 inches, helps pull the blood from your legs, and it boosts the blood pressure inside your upper torso and into your head, and gets your blood pressure back up, which also elevates your ability to transfer oxygen into these places and these organs. So that is probably the simplest thing you can do. And then, of course, people get cold when they're in shock. So trying to keep them warm, not hot, but keep them warm, also helps to reverse those effects. So hopefully I answered your question. That was a good one.
I hope so. Speaking of shock, another question that came in was, do we have more information on that? Is that something that OPT provides or has some additional training on?
Absolutely. So we do have the Oxygen Administrators course, and this is a course that can be added to first aid, CPR, and AED. We also have the bloodborne pathogen course as well. All of these are courses that we do offer. You can contact me. You can contact Lucas. We can get you more information on that, and kind of help you guys or point you in the right direction if you're even interested in this. We have differing people here at Lucas that offer varying backgrounds, which is fantastic. So one of my colleagues was a Navy diver, and we provided a training to some divers for a company here recently. And so he was able to bring a whole different perspective on administering oxygen that, say, a non-diver is able to do. So we have some variations and some combinations that can help you out. We can tailor it to your needs and your specialties. So just contact us and we can get you what you need.
Great. And then the last question that came in when you were discussing administering oxygen and kind of that loophole that for emergency use, someone asked if their company currently doesn't have oxygen on hand at their office, how do they go about procuring that for their company?
Yes, so you can get it through a provider locally. So we have here in our region, our gas suppliers like a Norco or an Oxarc. They can provide oxygen to you. They may ask that question and say, well, what is this for? You need a prescription in order to get this. Well, there is a loophole in the rules that allow for emergency use. So you can talk to a physician and say, hey, look, we're looking at adding this to our arsenal. And they won't necessarily have to write a prescription for you, but they can also help you kind of down the road of how to acquire it on a regular basis without hitting any hiccups and things like that. And we can too. We can kind of help you through that process of acquiring it and getting it into your EAP or emergency action plan and just built into your everyday operation and into your arsenal of tools.
Wonderful. Well, that was the last of the questions. Before we go, I want to remind everyone that we have some upcoming events. This month's continuing education event had to get rescheduled to April due to some unexpected circumstances that arose with one of our panelists. So feel free to register with the button below our slide deck here for that continuing education event. It will be a panel discussion on organizational leadership. And be sure to use the buttons also to register for next week's Our Performance Tips, where we will be joined by Jason Brewstead, where he will be discussing cognitive interviewing. I'd really like to thank you, Seth, for taking the time today to give this great presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Again, if your company does provide oxygen on site there, training is required. And if you're not sure if your company is up to date, feel free to reach out to Lucas OPT and we can help you out with that. Thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next week.